My dear friends, today let me describe to you how I handled a soft cataract and an epic epinucleus struggle. This patient had a soft cataract, and when I started the case, I thought this is going to be just another routine case of soft cataract. The clear corneal incision is made. This patient had a very shallow anterior chamber, and therefore I found it slightly difficult to be able to control the direction in which the capsular axis was moving. But eventually I got the control of the rexis and was able to complete it satisfactorily. However, I had a slightly larger size capsular rexis. Now see the mistake that I make at this point, that I start with the hydrodelamination straight away without even attempting hydrodissection. This is not a polar cataract, it's just a soft cataract. So what I should have done is first perform cortical cleavage hydrodissection to ensure that this nucleus will rotate, and then attempt a hydrodelamination to be able to bring out the soft endonucleus so that it can be easily emulsified. But I had completely forgotten to perform cortical cleavage hydrodissection, and for this mistake I am going to pay quite dearly a little later on in the surgery. I then continue with the procedure. I use a Sinskey hook to be able to pry the endonucleus up, and this is where I make my second mistake. In my overzealous enthusiasm to lift up the endonucleus, what I do is I actually yank the anterior capsule, as you can see in slow motion again, this point, creating a small area of zonular dialysis in my attempt to bring out the endonucleus. So I realized my mistake and I quickly revert back to normal. I slowly bring the endonucleus up, and with the phaco probe using pulse phaco settings and a power of about 30% and a vacuum of 350 millimeters of mercury, I am able to remove the endonucleus. At this point in time, I decide that because of the zonular dialysis, I will implant a capsule tension ring, and I decide to use the fishtail technique to implant it because I feel comfortable with this procedure, and also helps me to drop the CTR in an in situ manner into the capsular bag. So this is the CTR that is slightly flexed like a fishtail configuration. The head of the fishtail configuration is then fed into the capsular bag, and each of the dialing holes of the capsule tension ring is then put into place within the capsular bag. This type of insertion requires no rotation at all. Therefore, there is no risk of snagging on to cortical pieces, or there is no risk of worsening the zonular dialysis. So although I was happy that I successfully put in the capsule tension ring, the difficulty started at this point during the epinucleus removal. I'm using a pretty high vacuum of almost 550 millimeters of mercury. I mean, the air that you see getting sucked into the eye is because of the very high vacuum with which I'm working on. And with all my efforts, all I'm able to do is just manage to trim the edge of the epinucleus. And even with the highest of vacuum, the maximum vacuum of 600 millimeters of mercury, which is what the machine has, I'm not able to budge this epinucleus out of place. And the reason for this is because the capsule tension ring is firmly holding it in place like a girdle, like a cuff, preventing it from being mobilized. So I try my plan B, that is, I use viscoelastic I try to use viscoelastic to lift the epinucleus out. This has worked well for me many times and it has saved me in many situations. However, I find that in this particular case, plan B isn't really working. This is because the capsule tension ring is creating such a firm pressure on the cuff of epinucleus shell that the visco is not able to prolapse the epinucleus out of the capsular bag. So all that the visco does is to lift a small portion of the epinucleus, which I try to grasp hold of with my IA cannula, but it slips back into place and leaving me back to ground zero. And this is when I use my plan C, which is do it anyhow or do it somehow. And I try to perform some manner in which to remove this epinucleus shell. I think of a way. And as I inject viscoelastic, I see that some of the visco has found its way behind the epinucleus shell, causing it to slightly lift up. And using a Sinskey hook, I scratch over this area in order to create a break in the epinucleus shell. And then using the IA, coaxial IA probe, I'm able to go behind this break. So it's like how a sheet of ice is broken and giving us access to what lies behind it. Very gently I maneuver myself underneath the epinucleus sheet and then aspirate. So in a manner I'm able to remove this epinucleus sheet from inside out. So at this point I am quite relieved to know that somehow I'm able to get control of this epinucleus sheet, which till a few minutes back I was totally at my wit's end as how I'm going to manage. And then using a combination of both the irrigation aspiration cannula as well as the Sinskey hook, I'm able to pass it underneath the epinucleus shell and lift it up and remove it with high vacuum. I'm working at a vacuum of around 600 millimeters of mercury here, which is the reason why the air bubbles are getting sucked inside the eye. And finally the entire epinucleus shell comes out of the eye. Of course, this is not the recommended way to remove the epinucleus shell. It would be much wiser to do a proper cortical cleavage hydrodissection to loosen the epinucleus shell before inserting the capsule tension ring. If I had done both of these steps before implanting the CTR, I would not have ended up in this difficult situation. So the rest of the cortex is then aspirated, and the final step is to implant the intraocular lens, which thankfully goes on without a hitch. So here are my learnings in this case. Firstly, always perform cortical cleavage hydrodissection before hydrodelamination, except of course in a polar cataract, even if it is a soft cataract. I could have hydrodissected and loosened the epinucleus a bit before inserting the capsule tension ring. Remember, it's definitely going to be difficult to remove the cortex after the implantation of the capsule tension ring. In this particular case, fortune favored the bolt and I was able to get away without too much of a scratch. I thank you for your attention.